Welcome to our panel on the domestic consequences of the 2020 election. I'm going to go ahead and dive right in because we've got an illustrious panel of faculty and experts who are going to talk to you about the potential consequences of this election in a variety of different areas. Let me just introduce them to you, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. So we have first Shauna Marshall, the Honorable Raymond L. Sullivan Professor of Law and co-director of the Center for Racial and Economic Justice at UC Hastings, who will talk about the role of race and racism in our elections. We have Sarah Hooper, the Executive Director of the UCSF UC Hastings Consortium on Law, Science, and Health Policy, who will discuss the future of the Affordable Care Act. We have Zach Price, Harry and Lillian Hastings Chair and Professor of Law, who will briefly sketch the long-term trend of increasing partisan polarization in Congress and the electorate, and describe the incentives that divided government will create for the Biden administration to use administrative power aggressively. And we'll discuss how the Congress and the courts may respond to those exercises of executive power. And then finally, we have Rory Little, the Joseph W. Pochette Professor of Law, who will discuss various consequences of the election, including potential executive orders to be issued right away, changes at the U.S. Department of Justice, prospects for legislative action in criminal justice reform, most prominently police violence initiatives. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Shauna.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I have to say, I was reluctant to participate because no one wants a Debbie Downer at a party, and I feel that my remarks may be a little bit depressing. I have to say that I am relieved that Biden won. I am thrilled that our alum and my friend Kamala is now the vice president-elect and has broken many, many ceilings. But I have to also add, I am deeply disturbed that this was not only not a landslide, but that we have a Republican Party right now enabling President Trump in not moving forward with the transition. So why am I so depressed? Arne Duncan, who was Obama's Secretary of Education, the guy who brought us a lot more standardized tests, some think of him as a hero, some think that he set the cause of education backwards. Whatever your views, he's not exactly a radical guy or what I would say a white person who has focused his career on races. And yet after this election, he said, we need to stop parsing so much about red states and blue states and really look at the state of white racism in this country. And I think his worries are borne out. So I think I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about raw numbers. In 2016, we had over 100 million white people vote, and in 2020, that went up about 2.7 million to just about 103 million and counting. Because of the incredible increase of Latino voters and Asian American voters, the white vote has declined from 71% of the electorate to 65% of the electorate. And I want to say I've had to go to a few sources on stats, and I don't know that they're all completely accurate, but this is the best I can do. And I think what's also interesting as I give these stats, where I had trouble finding statistics says a lot. With respect to the Black vote, in 2016, we had 17.1 million Black voters, and now we have about 19 million, up 2 million, and they represent a little less now than 13% of the electorate. The biggest jump was with our Latino participation. In 2016, we had 12.6 Latino voters. 2020, we had over 20 million Latino voters. They are now the second largest voting bloc after whites in the United States, surpassing African Americans. Their increase was 65%, and 2/3 of Latino voters came out who were eligible to vote. I don't have great stats on Asian Americans, but I do know that they increased in the number of 3.6 million people, which is a large percentage increase. And 30% of Asian Americans who voted were first-time voters. I don't have the overall numbers for Native Americans. And I think both of those facts, after my looking and not finding, says a lot. Now let's look at how those groups voted. In 2016, 62% of Trump voters were white men. 62% of white men voted for Trump. That decreased in 2020 to 58% voting for Trump. White women sadly went up in their numbers for Trump, 52% in 2016, and it looks like they're hovering at 55% now. Black men voted for Trump at 13% in 2016 and now at 18% in 2020. Black women voted for 4% of them voted for Trump in 16, 8% in 2020. And I don't have the 2016 numbers for Asians, but Asian men voted for Trump at 25% in 2020, but Asian women voted for him at over 37%, which is a huge discrepancy and one of the largest of all racial groups. Latinos, only 33% voted for Trump, even with conservative voters in Florida and the Rio Grande area of Texas. I have very limited numbers of Native Americans, but I do know that the Navajo, Apache, and Coconino counties in Arizona voted at a rate of 79,000, one of their highest votes. And of that, only 3% went for Trump, 97% went for Biden, really helping carry Arizona. And they also, the Native American, the Sioux, the Blackfoot, the Crow, the Cheyenne, and the Crow Creek voted in higher numbers in both South Dakota and Montana. So we see how this broke down. And what is really, really disturbing is that without people of color, we would have another 4 years of Trump. One of the ways I think Blacks cope with white supremacy has always been through stories told among themselves and jokes. And now, as my daughter's saying, Mommy, you want to know what's going on? Check out people on Black Twitter. So I've been trying to check out Black Twitter. And one comment really sat with me. And that was a man who wrote that the presidential election reminds him of a football game, where every 4 years, it is like the Black quarterback who's been benched for the first 3 quarters. And now we're at the last quarter, the team is losing. The coach says to the Black quarterback, you better go out there and win the game for us. The Black quarterback goes out there, wins the game for them, and then at the next game, he's benched. And I think this time it's even more painful because we've had 4 years of incredibly incompetent, xenophobic, racist leadership with a lazy leader. We've had a pandemic that has brought forth all the inequities of our healthcare system, that has reminded us that other than medical workers, our essential workers are still brown and Black. They're cleaning our hospitals, they're taking care of our elderly, they're growing our food, they're working in our restaurants, and they're dying at higher numbers. We've had a summer of incredible racial unrest and a leader who has sided on the side of white supremacy, and yet most American white voters say, okay, 4 more years of the same. I read an interesting article by a freelance journalist named Umar Haag, who said that white Americans stand alone among Western democracies, and he was including in that group Western Europe, Japan, Canada, and the 2 countries down under. And he said, they are the only group. White Americans stand alone in voting against affordable higher ed, accessible health care, publicly supported parenting leave and childcare, adequate retirement. And instead they vote for support of more weapons, whether it's guns or weaponry for the military. And he said, yet they don't really vote to support those who serve in the military. His conclusion is that white Americans actually vote like those people wanting a failed state, and they mimic the values of regimes that Americans label as regressive, sectarian, authoritative, and fundamentalist. His conclusions were that our focus as a country on white exceptionalism and demonization of the other has put blinders on white Americans and has led them to vote against their own interest time and time again. And I see it as somewhat as a people who are struggling, and yet they vote to continue their struggle. Most white Americans, this author concluded, did not benefit from the policies of Trump, yet they hold on to his rhetoric and hate with incredible fervor. Black Twitter, one woman said, the election was just another referendum on whether or not we want to continue to be a racist state, and most white people checked, yes, we do. So why is this? Why do white Americans vote so differently from other white Western democracy voters? And I posit that it's because we were built on two sins: genocide and land theft and slavery. And we were reinforced with unjust systems, beginning with the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that allowed us to steal Mexican land, the Bracero programs, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Alien Land Laws, Jim Crow, redlining, the inadequacies of the GI Bill that only benefited white veterans, and on and on and on. Because when you have policies like that are so ingrained and so consistent, you have to convince your electorate that they make sense and that they benefit white people. And yes, some of them truly did benefit white people, particularly the theft of land. But many of the other policies that we pursue continue to destroy our country. And I believe that what we have done as a nation is that we created these incredibly terrible narratives to sustain the policies of Jim Crow and land theft, et cetera, et cetera. And these narratives have really been ingrained in white DNA over 400 years. They have told our white electorate that certain people really aren't like you. They don't feel pain the way you do. They're more barbaric. They will hurt your women. They will hurt you. They're not as intelligent. They're not deserving of these benefits. And it is so ingrained that the same journalist concluded that people would rather suffer than share benefits with the undeserving. I also think it's an incredible lack of education and understanding of our history that has led us to the fact that without people of color, we would basically be voting for 4 more years of Trump and heading into what feels like fascism. So, what do I conclude my upbeat view with? How do we turn this around? I've spent over 40 years as a social justice lawyer, and I have to conclude that the United States needs to stop tinkering around the edges of our original sins. We need to do what Germany did. We need to face our history, and for that, we'd first have to really learn our history, and so much of it has been whitewashed and hidden. We then have to teach our history fully and the consequences and the fallout of that history to the American student. And then we have to repair it. We have to own it and repair it. And speaking of Twitter, I will end with a tweet that Dan Rather put out today. He said, and I feel this so strongly, there is no healing without a reckoning on our constant injustice. So, Debbie Downer's done. I will pass the baton.
Shauna, thank you so much. I think it's a really important framing for the entire conversation around this. As we start to talk about more technical law reform and policy reform, to realize that it's happening against the backdrop of what Shauna described. So thank you very much for setting the table. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Hooper.
Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to be on this panel with all of you, and only sorry that I have to follow Shauna because I think those remarks could certainly more than stand on their own. So to try and talk about what's been happening here and the future of the Affordable Care Act, given the new composition of the court, the oral arguments from this morning, and of course, a Biden administration. So I'm going to try and fit this into the size of the window. There we go. And I think I have maybe a slightly more optimistic perspective to provide today than Shauna has, but only modestly. And if I have time, I'm going to try to loop back to some of the things that Shauna raised, because actually they are quite relevant to the future of health policy and the health of this country. So as everyone knows, healthcare was really front and center in this election, as it has been for a very long time in this country, in part because COVID has really illuminated and sharpened awareness of the significant gaps in our health and public health infrastructure in the US. But of course, how to address these problems remains hotly contested within the Democratic Party and across the parties as well. Since the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, the public has remained fairly divided in its view of the act, but since about 2017, there's been a clear majority of the public that favors the Affordable Care Act, and in particular, the provisions that are the most well-known, which are the protections for pre-existing conditions. And excuse me. Can we see my whole screen? No. Yes. Pardon me, I'm running into some issues here with my slides. So the ACA has been, in the 10 years since the ACA was passed, it has really been embedded across our very fragmented and deep healthcare system, and now affects pretty much everyone in the country, with the exception maybe of military families. So the Affordable Care Act, provided reforms in the individual marketplace for healthcare insurance, which is about 6% of the population. It provided reforms in the employer-based insurance markets, which is 50% of the US population. It greatly expanded Medicaid to new categories of individuals, and that affects about 20% of the population. And there are reforms in the Medicare program as well, in which about 14% of the US population is enrolled. The Affordable Care Act also had some population health measures, anti-discrimination provisions, and for instance, gave the FDA authority to approve biosimilars in an attempt to reduce drug cost. So I raise this just as a refresher, because I think we spend a lot of time talking about the individual mandate and pre-existing conditions, but in fact, the Affordable Care Act is a very sprawling piece of legislation that is affecting all of us. The Affordable Care Act was also successful in extending coverage to an additional nearly 20 million individuals. And, you know, if you are someone who is age 26 and still on your parents' health insurance, that's because of the Affordable Care Act. If you receive subsidies, you're an independent contractor and you receive subsidies to purchase health insurance in the California Health Exchange, that is because of the Affordable Care Act. If you haven't had to pay a copay for your birth control for the last several years, that is because of the Affordable Care Act. So really just, I think, to reinforce how significant this piece of legislation is, and also how controversial it has been. So, you know, the law has been subject to many existential challenges over the years, and the most recent of which has landed in front of the Supreme Court this morning. So in California versus Texas, the what is before the court is, excuse me, my notes aren't here. What is before the court is another constitutional challenge to the act brought by 20 Republican attorneys general, 2 governors, and 2 individuals. What essentially they're challenging is that the law is no longer constitutional because in 2017, Congress reduced the individual mandate penalty to $0. And their argument is that if the penalty is no longer generating revenue for the federal government, this is no longer a valid exercise of Congress's taxing power. If you'll remember in 2012, a previous challenge to the Affordable Care Act, another group of Republican governors, AGs, and 2 individuals had challenged the law, saying that this was in excess of Congress's Commerce Clause authority and Spending Clause authority. And Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, agreed that this exceeded Commerce Clause authority, but upheld it as an exercise of Congress's taxing power. And Congress, you know, had spent years, if you'll recall, attempting to repeal and replace the law, and had been unsuccessful in doing so, in large part because the Republican majority was unable to come up with an alternative plan, and protections for pre-existing conditions have been incredibly popular. So really what they were able to do was reduce the penalty to $0. The subsequent litigation around this, you know, possibly threatening the whole law. I think no one really saw this litigation going very far, but Judge Reed O'Connor, who has been a feature and not a bug in Affordable Care Act litigation over the years, found that the $0 penalty did exceed Congress's authority under the taxing power and struck down the entire statute, and the Fifth Circuit upheld that decision, and now here we are. So it's been a long and interesting road in terms of Affordable Care Act legislation. And I think the conversation today sort of reflected that. So there are 3 kind of issues before the court right now. One is the standing of individual plaintiffs and states to be bringing this litigation now. 2 is the issues on the merits. So is the individual mandate with the $0 penalty an appropriate exercise of congressional power? And if no, is the mandate severable from the rest of the Affordable Care Act? And if you listen to the arguments this morning, really the action was around the first and third issues. So the standing issue and the severability issue. And I think the reason there wasn't more focus on the merits, of course, is because the 4 conservative justices are on the record in NFIB versus Sebelius, they would not have upheld the law under Congress's taxing authority, and they're not likely to change their minds now. The newest justice, Amy Coney Barrett, has written that she disapproved of that decision at that time. So I think it's unlikely that she would find that Congress has such authority now. And so I think, the time was really spent on the standing and severability issues. So the justices really seemed skeptical, even the more conservative justices, that individual plaintiffs facing a $0 penalty are really facing sufficient harm to justify standing in this case. There was some argument about whether, the moral force of law by itself with no penalty was still enough for standing, but I think I sensed some skepticism even among the more conservative justices on that front. I think the state standing seemed to get more traction with the judges. So the states are essentially arguing that in implementing the Medicaid provisions of the law, they're incurring administrative costs that they would not otherwise incur. Justice Kagan seemed very concerned that this was going to open up a floodgates problem, that if we permitted states or any plaintiff to allege harm in one section of a law and then sort of be able to challenge an entirely different section of the law, that this would create an opportunity for plaintiffs to bring all kinds of challenges to legislation that they disapprove of, but otherwise don't have a as a result of. But I think that enough of the judges, at least I'm interested to hear what my colleagues who saw the oral argument this morning think of this, but my sense was that there is likely to be a majority of the court that finds enough standing in the states to move through that issue. So I think really my kind of projection is that the action is going to be around severability. And the issue with severability, and this prompted the quip from Chief Justice Roberts, did we spend all that time talking about broccoli for nothing? If you remember, this was Justice Scalia in one of the earlier Affordable Care Act cases, used really colorful hypotheticals to sort of poke at, the reasonableness, the extent of Congress's power to sort of compel public health measures like eating broccoli. And so there was a lot of time and angst spent around the Congress's authority to pass the individual mandate. And so and at the time, the federal government was arguing that the individual mandate was really critical to the rest of the Affordable Care Act. And that is true. When the Affordable Care Act was first argued and passed, the idea was that we had to, in order to provide protections for more people, in order to make that marketplace work, you had to get more people in the pool. And so we had to have both carrots and sticks to get people into the insurance pool in order to make this market function. Since then, and in particular, because we had the $0 penalty for 3 years, there was functionally no mandate, we found that there really is no sort of radical disruption to the marketplace caused by a lack of a mandate. And so in sort of empirical fact, the mandate is not as crucial to the Affordable Care Act as we thought it would be. And the carrots or the subsidies to help make insurance more affordable turn out to be more essential. So what was sort of interesting here was, Roberts is pointing out, hey, you argued many years ago that this was central to the functioning of the law, and now California, you are arguing that it is severable from the rest of the statute. But I think, there was sort of some, Thomas sort of pointed out that, that this argument had been made that there is still lingering language in the statute that indicates that the individual mandate is really central to the rest of the statute. But I think, what seemed to convince more of the judges, and in particular, Justice Kavanaugh, indicated that he felt this was a fairly straightforward case for severability, is A, the very strong presumption of severability, B, the idea that Congress could have repealed the statute and chose not to, and instead chose to just make the individual mandate effectively inoperative by making the mandate zero. And C, if the Congress had intended to draft a non-severability provision, in the words of Justice Kavanaugh, they know how to do that. So I think, my projection is that I think that the plaintiffs will make it past standing. I think as much as I sort of disagree with the idea that Congress lacks any taxing power simply because they don't have an active source of revenue from a particular tax, I think that's sort of a specious argument. But I think ultimately they're going to make it past the standing and merits, and we're going to get to severability, and there will be 5-4 with Kavanaugh in the majority to sever the mandate from the rest of the Affordable Care Act. And as I've sort of been discussing, the insurance markets will be okay. How do I know? Again, because we've lived for 3 years without a real individual mandate, and the sky has not fallen. And this will, I think, really be important because healthcare is 20% of our GDP. And so leaving 20% of our GDP undisrupted, I think, would be a conservative approach here. And, to the extent the court is sensitive to these kind of partisan wins, the conservatives can still call a win if the court strikes down the individual mandate, right? Leaving aside the fact that it's not a very functional mandate, it's still at least colorably a win. And, I think the court would really be out on a limb, striking down the entire Affordable Care Act, because, fairly significant majorities of the public are in favor of the Affordable Care Act and do not want the Supreme Court to overturn it. And that includes significant majorities of Republicans who are in favor of provisions such as the protections for pre-existing conditions. And I think the challenge there is that if the court were to attempt to carve out and sever even the pre-existing condition protections from the rest of the act, that would require the court to go on somewhat of a fishing expedition through the law, because those protections are more complex. And disentangling those, I think, would require the kind of fishing that at least Thomas and Gorsuch have indicated that they are uncomfortable with in severability analyses. So, the other, I think, real challenge, of course, is that there are limited options for a Biden administration to cure defects in the Affordable Care Act. So were the court to entirely strike down the Affordable Care Act, there is a deadlocked Congress. So assuming the Senate assuming Republicans maintain control of the Senate, I see very little likelihood that they would be able to arrive at some kind of agreement for a replacement for the Affordable Care Act. And there, I think that the Biden administration will continue to push the limits of executive authority, but to try to reconstruct something as complicated as the Affordable Care Act would likely be beyond anything that can be done outside of Congress.
Sarah, this is Jody. Thanks very much. I'm going to jump in at this point to pivot to discussions of executive authority so that we can make sure and get our other panelists in here. So we'll look forward to hearing from you again with questions and discussion.
Right.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go to Zach next.
You're muted.
Zach, you're muted.
Sorry, rookie mistake. All right, so I have some slides as well. So first of all, thanks to all of you for being here. I'm delighted to be part of this panel and get to share a few thoughts and hear from the other panelists. And I thought what I'd try and do, I think the limited value I can add here is to try and offer a kind of descriptive account of what's sort of been happening in the U.S. electoral system, or at least some important trends over the past few decades that I think provide some context both for Trump and also this most recent election. So what I'm going to try and do is just very briefly sketch some important trends in U.S. national politics, offer a few thoughts on how this election fits in, and then maybe a few predictions about how the federal government will operate in the next few years as the Biden administration gets going. So the main trend I want to emphasize is, I'm sure you've heard about this, but the big trend in US politics over the past 30 years or so has been this increasing partisan polarization. There have been points in US history when the two parties were sort of baggy coalitions without a whole lot of coherence, but over the past few decades, they've become increasingly ideological. And you see this in this is, survey data, seeing how people are sorting into parties based on their outlook, and the kind of center of gravity in each party is pulling apart as well. There also a high degree of identity-based polarization, as the statistics Shauna gave describes. So that's sort of submerged in these figures as well. But so it shows up in the electorate, and importantly, it shows up really powerfully in congressional behavior. So this is a graph showing a measure of partisan polarization in Congress, basically measuring how consistently members of one party vote with their co-partisans against the other side. You see, it's very high in the Gilded Age, went down in the kind of post-war period, has been on this really sharp upward trajectory in the past few decades. So Congress gained more polarized, right? The voters are sorting into these ideological coalitions. Actually, here's another just representation of Congress, right? Back in the night, this is just snapshots of two different Congresses. Back in the 60s, there's a lot of ideological overlap between the two coalitions. Nowadays, it tends to be true that the most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. So another aspect of this is so-called negative partisanship. So we get these two sorted coalitions. We get more ideologically sorted candidates. We also, partisanship has increasingly become a kind of central feature of people's identities. It's sometimes maybe partly because it often aligns with other characteristics, but you see the showing up in people reporting things like, viewing the other side as evil or being afraid of them and so forth. And so, that may be justified, but what's electorally significant is sort of mutual, right? It shows up in both sides. So how does this shape voting behavior? One thing is you get increasingly party line voting. So people used to vote pretty regularly for one party for president, another party for Congress, for example, split ticket voting. That's what this graph is showing, but that's gone way down. People tend to vote kind of ideologically one way or the other, as reflecting these broader trends. But there is a group of people sort of floating in the middle, right, who are either moderate and don't particularly like either party as they've pulled away, or maybe agree with one party on some issues and not others. And they kind of seem to go back and forth. And so this has produced an environment where the two parties seem to be pretty evenly matched across recent decades, at least in terms of national electoral outcomes. And so this is showing kind of party composition in the Senate. And you see, political scientists refer to this the period of insecure majorities, unstable majorities, right? There was a long period when the Democrats were, consistently in control, but starting the past few decades, they kind of just flip-flop back and forth. Same is true in the House, some ways even more pronounced. And this is ending in 2014, so these have crossed again in 2018. So we've got this kind of polarization, parties pulling apart, and neither able to establish kind of durable electoral dominance, either overall or in a particular institution like Congress or the presidency. And again, that's not the way things always are, right? Throughout this period, the Democrats are dominant in Congress pretty consistently. So I think that, that provides a lot of context for how someone like Trump was able to become president in the first place. But I think maybe fast forward to sort of where we are now in 2020. So how does 2020 fit into this picture? So Trump lost, obviously, and pretty decisively in some important ways. But an interesting thing about the election is that Biden won despite the Democrats not doing terribly well overall. They overall did, they had more votes overall, right? But they actually lost seats in the House sort of unexpectedly. The Senate looks like a toss-up, depending on what happens in Georgia. Didn't do terribly well in state level races. And so how should we interpret that? So what it sort of, we get this sort of split verdict, which in some ways bucks against those trends I was describing. And so, it's always a bit artificial to interpret the kind of collective judgment of hundreds of millions of people voting. But I think one could view this as a kind of repudiation of Trump personally, while also a kind of signal of some unease with the Democratic agenda overall. So in particular, there must have been, this shows up clearly in some places like New England, you get people splitting their tickets in a way they haven't in a long time to vote against Trump while also voting for Republicans. So what might that mean for the next few years, right, for the Biden administration? So we're very likely to have divided government, even if Democrats win one or two seats in Georgia. They'll have a very slim margin in the Senate, slim margin in the House. Moderate senators, members with a strong interest in showing independence will have a lot of influence. And Biden himself has sort of positioned himself to be conciliatory. So it might be a sort of golden age of moderation that breaks some of these trends I was describing. Hopefully it'll lower the temperature in some ways. But I don't know. I'm not terribly optimistic. It's going to be hard to get any really major legislation through. And so I think another pattern that has shown up across these decades will reassert itself, which is that presidents tend to turn to executive and administrative authorities to deliver policy goals that they can't get through Congress, right? So a feature of Congress being so polarized is it makes it harder to legislate, harder for people to compromise, right? Their incentives are more to kind of play to their base than reach across the aisle. So overall, that pattern is likely to continue. And so at the same time, right, when you have more ideological parties, right, there's pressure on the president from one coalition to the other to try and deliver goals for their base. So I suspect perhaps not immediately, but eventually we'll fall back into a pattern we've seen across these decades of presidents using executive authority, administrative authority to try and as kind of primary drivers of policy. And so, I hate to be cynical, but what this generally yields is that everyone's about to flip-flop on their views of key separation of powers and administrative law questions, right? Executive powers can be hip again, right? Courts are going to go from being saviors of the republic to reactionary obstructionists. But so it goes. I mean, I think this kind of flip-flopping, I think it creates some problems and some instability, but I think it's going to continue until some of these underlying trends break. In the meantime, if nothing else, it gives lawyers and law professors some interesting legal questions to think about. So thanks again. Look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks very much, Zach. And now we've got Rory.
Sorry, rookie mistake, and I'm a lot older than Zach. I see we're out of time, so that's my presentation. Just kidding. Shauna Marshall and I started on the same day some years ago, and we agree on everything. And so the first thing I want to say is I'm really glad she was here. I'm really glad she started us off, and I'm really glad she made the point she did. And if you didn't get the point, here it is. A white majority in this country voted for Trump. Full stop. You draw whatever consequences from that you would like. I, on the other hand, will bookend the Debbie Downer with the whatever upper and try to say some exciting things. So first of all, I'm pointing to the best consequence of this election right here. This is Kamala Harris, first woman vice president, first many other things, and a superstar, as I've said on the media for years. We know at Hastings that she's so good. She's our alum, but the rest of the country is going to learn that, or has learned it. So here's some potential consequences. I've set my timer for 8 minutes. Actually, it's down to a little less than that, and I'll stop when it goes off. I've got 3 things I want to talk about. First, whether the Senate is controlled by the Democrats or not, and that does depend on the Georgia runoff, and it is unlikely that both of those seats would go Democratic, although I would not, bet on that one way or the other. Whether it's controlled by the Democrats or not, the president has a fair amount of power with executive orders. And this president will issue executive orders immediately. And we know that. There will be a COVID task force. There will be a reversal of the DACA policy or a reinstatement of Obama's DACA policy. There will be a rejoining of the Paris agreements for environmental law fans. And there will be a number of other things that happen in the first week, day, months of this administration, and those can be done without anybody's approval. They will be challenged undoubtedly in the courts. We have not seen the end of litigation in the courts over executive orders. And by the way, there's a lot of Trump judges on the bench now, but I predict that you're going to see some positive changes right away. Another thing I thought I should address, changes in the US Department of Justice. I used to work in the Department of Justice. There will be big changes in the Department of Justice. Bill Barr will be gone. We could stop there too. That's a positive consequence, in my opinion. One of the worst attorney generals in the history of this country, which is a shame because I knew him back in 1989, and we thought maybe this was a guy with some ethics and experience that would bring some sense to this administration. Turns out we were completely wrong. Here's a thought for you. I've seen this on Twitter, I guess. Let's appoint Merrick Garland Attorney General. Wouldn't that be some interesting payback? Now, whether the Senate would confirm, I don't know, but they never gave him a hearing before. Maybe they should at least give him a hearing now. There will be a new Solicitor General. The current Solicitor General who's acting is a former Justice Thomas clerk. The new Solicitor General will not be a former Justice Thomas clerk. He or she will be a former something else. So there's that. And there will be changes in the ranks. You saw that yesterday, the head of the election corruption unit of Department of Justice resigned because Barr has issued another order cutting back on 40 years of DOJ policy, you will see all of the lower level positions filled with new people. So there will be some major changes. Civil rights will start to be enforced. Whether the antitrust lawsuit against Google goes forward will be a question. How about the Supreme Court? Should we expand the Supreme Court? Should we get payback? Well, first, we're not going to do that unless we control the Senate. And let me just say, there are some members of the Senate on the Republican side who may decide to vote with the Democrats, given how scared they were of their own reelection, and given that a number of the senators will be facing reelection in less than 2 years. But I don't think you're going to see Joe Biden expand the court, or people call it pack the court. I think maybe you're going to wait and see how the court rules in important cases like the California versus Texas case that Sarah was talking about. And I agree with her that I think the court is likely to not strike down the entire act based on the severability argument. Justice Kavanaugh seemed to be very clear about that. Whether he can hang in there with some strength of character, we'll see. But he has life tenure. Will Justice Breyer retire is a big question. People criticized Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I used to have her picture hanging here for the last 4 weeks because she didn't retire and let Obama appoint a new justice. I don't think Justice Breyer is going to retire unless he believes that the Senate will confirm someone in his vein or more liberal. If it's controlled by the Republicans, I don't think he will retire. If he were to retire, there are some incredibly talented women of color who could be appointed to replace him. Leandra Kruger on the California Supreme Court. Melissa Murray, a former dean of a different law school in the Bay Area, who's now teaching on the East Coast. That's just 2 of 100 that you could talk about. There are some very talented people who are waiting to see. The last thing I thought I'd talk about is what are the prospects for criminal justice reform? There is a transition website for the Biden-Harris transition, and that's what they're calling it, Biden-Harris transition, not just the Biden transition. Again, what they can achieve legislatively depends on their Senate politicking. But remember, Joe Biden has some deep ties to the Senate. I wouldn't put it out of the range to get a few Republican votes. The most important thing I think that we should look for is the transition site lists 4 things that they want to do with regard to criminal justice. The most important is what's called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was passed by the House by an overwhelming majority and then sat on McConnell's desk like almost everything else and didn't ever get acted on. But it was sponsored by, among others, Kamala Harris as the senator. By the way, she's still a senator until January 20th. So she still has some swing there. In light of the George Floyd, the Breonna Taylor, we could go on for a list of how many cases, police violence, particularly against people of color, defunding the police. I think you're going to see that legislation really pick up some steam. And part of it, at least, is going to be enacted. For example, possibly a nationwide ban on chokeholds. That couldn't be good. That couldn't be better than good for everybody, right? That is not a racial issue, although it is visited most disparately on people of color. There will be a use of force standard in this legislation that should be adopted by every jurisdiction. There will be a national commission to engage in police oversight. And I think that could be done by executive order, not just legislation. And there will be some kind of limitation put on police departments buying weapons of war from the military or being given these weapons of war. Whether they need those weapons of war, I'm not so sure, but there should be some restrictions on the practice. So I think there are actually a lot of benefits that come out of this election and a lot of positive consequences that you can look for right away. I saw a question, this is the last thing I'll say, in the chat, that is Biden's win set in stone, was asked in the chat. So I don't put anything out of the realm of possibility. It certainly looks like it's not likely to be disturbed, but there are recounts that will happen in Georgia. There will be challenges to votes in Arizona and in Pennsylvania. There have already been a dozen lawsuits filed by Trump people, although most of them have already been dismissed by the judges that heard them. So keep your eyes open between now and January 20th. But I think the most interesting reaction to me is that America seems to be quiet right now compared to what we thought might happen. Would there be violence in the streets by the Proud Boys? Thank God there hasn't been, so far as I know. A lot of people believe in the electoral system, and they believe in this millions of votes, that it's just too hard to fake or to fraud so many. So my prediction, as you hear my alarm going off, is that this will stick and that you should look forward to the next administration. And taking constitutional law will not be quite as interesting as it's been in the last 4 years. Thank you.
Come on, Rory, I'm not so sure about that. All right, who has got questions? Go ahead and raise your hand or put questions in the chat, and we'll take some time to respond. Matt Coles.
Professor.
Donna, I was just wondering, after listening to what Zach said and taking your prescription for what needs to be done to make any change, how do you see starting down that road, given the lay of the land that Zach laid out?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Hi, Matt. One is, I grew up being told the power of education is huge, right? And right now, I think we are in a country where we get very different information. And we get the kind of information that confirms our own biases. So if you're, just listening to Fox News and get certain feeds on your social media, you're going to continue to get confirmation bias. So one of the things I do think needs to happen is we do really have to look at how information is disseminated, not just on the news, but in social media. And it does mean, because this is such a brave new world, that we rethink how different information is regulated and validated for its authenticity. But I also think that all of us, and especially those of us in academia, need to really think about how we impart information and what do we include in our historical analyses and in our reasons for the outcomes of some of our policies. And I think, before I spent so much time teaching the race, racism, and American law course, I thought I was actually pretty up to date and astute about our racial history. And as I did more and more research, I have to say, I found myself feeling incredibly naive and much more optimistic about the reasons that many of our propertied so-called founding fathers did what they did. And I think it's imperative on all of us to do that and to teach our students accordingly, that we first do the work and teach what we've learned. One of the things I'm really thinking about doing, and I've been talking to people in education who teach middle and high school, is really working on curriculum reform in our early teaching, because that is where I think we can change minds and hearts and bring understanding for the next round of voters. And we have to intervene early, and we have to intervene honestly. So, I mean, these are big, big, big undertakings, but it has to start with each of us. And those of us who live our lives, not thinking about race all the time, to understand that it's imperative on all of us to do this work, because you can't really rely on a disaffected community of color that seldom gets the protections and social programs it deserves to keep protecting the white majority from itself. It is time the white majority takes that up too.
Great, thank you, Shauna. So I'm seeing a question in the chat that I'm going to direct to perhaps Zach or Rory. This is from Rory. I see you're already on top of it. You want to talk about this one?
Sure. And I'm going to have to sign off in a few minutes. Firuz Abdullah, who's in our career services office, I'm sure you all know her, asks, is this person who has to certify that Biden is the winner able to keep him from getting transition funding? The statutory test for this is that there must be funding given to the apparent winner. At some point, it's going to become obvious that it's apparent. Maybe this will be after the recount in Georgia, or the challenges in Pennsylvania fail, or Arizona. And there may be a lawsuit filed. You can imagine a lawsuit demanding that she comply with the statute. The Supreme Court has been the emergency stay safe haven for a lot of Trump lawsuits. I don't know whether they'd give an emergency ruling in this one, but I do think at some point a parent is going to have to be given some meaning, and she's not going to be able to withstand the pressure. Zach, what do you think?
Zach, do you have any?
I don't think the challenges are going to go anywhere. I mean, I think, there may be some degree of irregularity, there always is, but the margins are just too great. And, at some point we'll have to accept that. I mean, it's very unfortunate that she's not releasing the money, but that's probably right. Eventually she'll have to give way.
Okay, so I see that we're a little past our official ending time. I know that folks have other plans after this. I just want to thank our panelists again for sharing their views and their thoughts and their insights with us. Thank you all for coming, and I hope that this is just the beginning of many interesting conversations that we will have in our classrooms and the virtual hallways and with one another going forward. So thanks very much, and until next time.